Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the Rethink 2022. I hope everyone enjoyed these 2 days of great sessions. My name is Jamel. I'm going to be, speaking about supply chains over the next hour or so. And the theme, I think, in this session, as it is in past ones, is um, we need to do things a bit differently. The world economy is starting to become more and more complex, and the way we tackled things in the past are different now. Okay. I think COVID brought that to light in terms of supply chains. The pandemic has really constrained our supply chains. So, how we rethink about supply chains now is different than the way it was in the past. And we need to go and discuss that in this session. A bit about myself. I'm the chief economist at BDO. I work in the firm's tax practice. I conduct complex transfer pricing studies. In addition to transfer pricing, we set up a economic consulting practice that's involved in producing cost benefit analysis, economic impact studies, so on and so forth. So I'm going to put my contact info at the end of this slide. Any questions or concerns, give me a shout, give me an email. Okay. Supply chains. Supply chains are good. Supply chains are good because it helps businesses and consumers, maximize their welfare or their profits. So there's no doubt that there are benefits to supply chains. Supply chains have improved the plights of billions of people around the world, not only on this continent, but in Asia. But with every single supply chain comes a risk, right? And the pandemic has shown that risk, right? So, how we try to insulate supply chains against risks depends on a lot of factors. And we're going to go and talk about that today. Okay. So, what I want you to think about is supply chains are good, even if they result in offshoring of jobs to Asia or to Southeast Asia or to Latin America, because we get the benefits of lower costs. Okay. So that is where we're going to start off our presentation. I want to first spend a couple of moments talking about China and supply chains and how things have occurred over time. So we are thinking about a world that is now global in nature. Supply chains back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were quite domestic or in the realm of a continent. China's open door policy in 1978 exposed China to the world. Okay. So big change has come to the global economy. When we think about supply chain, we are thinking about outsourcing. Okay. And that's a very important theme in this talk. There's a movement of jobs to China for production of tangible goods. There are movements of jobs to India for certain types of services, right? But it all comes down to moving production to low tax or low cost countries, right? And given that's the case, we need to go and factor that into our risk assessment. Next slide, please. So when we think about outsourcing, it's just not about costs, okay? Cost is a big factor when we decide to outsource in the greater supply chain, okay? But that's not always the case. Think about the case of Apple, okay? Apple produces the iPhone. All the intellectual property is like handled out of out of California, but the production of the phone is done in China. Okay, Apple understands in the States that their strength is developing the IP, enhancing the IP. They also understand that their partners in China who make the phone are focusing on their core competencies in making the best physical phone possible. So Apple America is good at doing the IP. Apple Asia is good at producing the phone. So supply chains is not only about cost advantage and trying to minimize costs across the supply chain. It's also tied to allowing entities to focus on their core competencies. And we need to understand that on the go forward. Next slide, please. So here is the typical decision after someone leaves the high school in the West. Okay, they can go to a college, a skilled program to try and update their skills. They can go and try to go to a factory and either do complex manufacturing or low end manufacturing, or they can go and enter the low skilled labor market. Now, in a Western context, a lot of what we produce on a day-to-day basis, goods, autos, physical assets are being outsourced to China. So we do this in an attempt to maximize firm profit, also to focus on our core competencies. So we've seen this over the last 40 years as it ties to China, a building of the supply chains in a way to get the best product at the lowest price, right? So supply chains are trying to achieve this. Next slide, please. So if we go and look at the production of widgets in a Western context, we are starting to see a reduction in the amount of physical assets produced, such as cars, so on and so forth. The majority of our economy now, the majority of GDP in Canada is directly tied to the service space. So through time, our comparative advantage is going to change in the West, and we're going to produce more and more IP, for example, or more, services around IP, right? Low-cost countries are going to be able to develop a workforce that's going to be able to produce the widgets that we need, our autos, our phones, our physical assets that we need. Okay, so it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Canada's got a comparative advantage in service, and the United States has a comparative advantage in intellectual property. By everyone along our supply chain focusing on their core competencies, we're able to get the best product at the best price. And that's the key thing involved in trying to build a sustainable supply chain from the macro level. The next slide, please. So think about China. China is what it was considered the shop floor of the world, right? So everything that you can imagine was being produced in China starting in 1978, China's open door policy. So they made, computers, TVs, toys, pottery, shoes. Things are changing in our supply chain, right? China's one-child policy has changed the nature of the supply chain, and it will change the nature of the supply chain. Things are becoming more expensive in China because of the one-child policy. The demography of those on the shop floor has structurally changed. So we start to see older people who are demanding higher amounts of wage. That's starting to bid up the price of goods that are coming out of China. So we're starting to see a lot of relying of subcontracting in our supply chain. Lots of subcontracting in the Southeast Asia, for instance, to capture that lowest cost denomination. So China is the shop floor of the world. That's going to continue. That's not going to change, but it will change gradually over the next couple of decades. Next slide, please. Foxconn, it produces for Apple, right? Trusted partner in China, right? Apple in the US does not have core competencies in producing phones. It produces the intellectual property around the phone, right? Foxconn is the partner in Asia that produces the phone at the quality and price that Apple needs. So supply chains are something that we can never dispel. Supply chains are part and parcel the key ingredient in any macro economy. So putting up barriers, so for example, on trade partners serves only to hurt all economies and not one specific economy. We're all interconnected now. Next slide, please. Think about all the opportunities supply chains have brought to the world economy. So all those containers coming out of Southeast Asia into Western economies makes Asia a wealthier continent, makes us better off as well in terms of better price goods, right? We need to never lose sight of the fact that supply chains help our per capita income. It helps our our purchasing power. So we need to always protect our supply chains. And I hope after COVID is done, we're able to build our supply chains so they are resilient to future shocks because they're just too important to let it go to chance. Next slide, please. So I have a lot of clients in the property business. Lots of properties are being built through ideas coming out of the supply chain, prefab homes, storage lockers, things that capitalize on China's low cost skilled workforce in this sphere. So supply chains are an opportunity for everyone involved to maximize like the welfare of citizens. So we need to always keep that front and center if we're talking about supply chains. During COVID, there was some talk about trying to localize supply chains as a way to insulate against these shocks. And I think the world came to the conclusion that that's pretty tough to do, right? On a large scale, because there's so much infrastructure now that's gone into the supply chain. There's so much know-how that goes into a supply chain. Imagine trying to shift production from China to other countries in Southeast Asia. They just don't have the scale and scope to be able to shift that. So let's look at the supply chains for what they are. And the second part of this slide deck is going to talk about what we can do to like insulate it against the risks of shocks. Next slide, please. So a couple of long-term trends. I teach a class at the business school. I teach global business at the Telfer School of Business. And students really love this slide because, and they're executive MBA students, and they love this slide because it points to a new, reality in the economy of the world. The 21st century is lined up to be the century of Asia, right? 2028, the Chinese economy is going to overtake the US economy as the biggest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. In 2032, India is forecasted to overtake Japan as the second biggest economy, as the third biggest economy in the world, excuse me. Okay. By 2040, 2 out of every 5 people on Earth are going to be in India and China. So the gravity, the center of economic power, has shifted. So the West is still wealthy in per capita standards, GDP per capita, for instance. But as an absolute, China and India are closing the gap. So 2 out of 5 people on Earth are in 2 countries. these supply chains become very, very critical for global prosperity. The next slide, please. So, like, this is just some fun facts. So if there were 100 people, and we were to go and break it down by category, 5 people are going to come from Western Europe, a few from the Middle East, but the majority, or 4 out of 10 people, are going to come from 2 countries that make up the world. That is an astonishing number, because it just shows you how supply chains are going to intensify. And these 2 countries are going to have a big say in the global chain in this sphere. Next slide, please. So look at supply chains, okay? Look at developing Asia. Look at growth patterns. They're slowing now. And all economies are going to slow as they approach their steady states. But China was growing at an astonishing 12% in the 1980s, right? That means that their economy was doubling every 6 years. That's by the rule of 70. That there's a theorem that says, to predict how fast an economy doubles in GDP, it's roughly equal to 70 over the growth rate. So if an economy is growing at 7% a year, 70 over 7 suggests that that economy is going to double in 7 years. Take the Western economies, they're growing at 3% a year. It's going to take them about 22 years to double their GDP. So Asia is growing at an astonishing rate because their growth is compounding past economic growth. So things are slowing in Asia now. There was new data out of China. It grew last quarter at 8%. Okay, that's going to slow, obviously, as this pent-up demand starts to diminish and as the economies that start to open up. But this is how supply chains have benefited parts of Asia in a dramatic way. And it's the result of the intensification of supply chains. The next slide, please. Share of world GDP, Asia is starting to get a bigger share of its GDP. The Western share of global GDP is starting to go and taper off. So 21st century is going to look like a different picture than it does now. Asia will begin to become a major player in economic affairs around the world. The next slide, please. So I talked about this here. Simply put, the American economy will be overtaken by the Chinese economy. Before, it was based on 2032. Now more recent forecasts are saying that the world economy is going to see China overtake the United States by 2028, given the response to COVID. Okay, Japan is going to overtake. India is going to overtake Japan in 2032. And next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry. So we talked about that. Here, it just shows you how, as a percentage of world GDP, Asia is starting to really improve. India and China are getting a bigger share of GDP, and the American share of GDP is diminishing as a total, given the growth of Asia. And next slide, please. So if you press the slide again, it'll show another slide. Yeah. So as I was talking about, the Western economies are now depending more and more on supply chains, because not only are physical goods being subcontracted out to our partners in other countries like China, but in low-skilled jobs, we are starting to see this get farmed out through immigration or through outsourcing to other parts of Southeast Asia. So this is predictable, because we have the comparative advantage in like higher end services in Canada and complex R&D activity in Canada in the West. So we would expect that the supply chain is going to change such that we're going to lose jobs into certain sectors that are best done by other partners in the supply chains in different countries. Okay. So we shouldn't go and look at this as a threat. It's an opportunity. We want every country in the supply chain to focus on things that they're best at doing, right? And there has to be government policies that help our supply chains in a macro sense, right? Training folks who lose their jobs because of outsourcing into the growing sectors, and that there is a government issue, right? But at the macro, net GDPs always improve through trade, through increased supply chain intensities and scope. So we always want to ensure that we are keeping that front and center. The next slide, please. Yeah. So productive. So how productive are we all? When you say someone is productive, they're producing something at a less input costs than like another firm. So it's productive to realign our supply chains so that we are more productive. Two, we need to be more competitive along our supply chains, right? So we need to be able to market something at the lowest cost than like other firms. Focusing on our supply chains allows us to do that, right? Because you are trying to achieve two things in supply chain analysis. One, focus on core competencies, which means quality. And two, ensure that we get a cost efficiency, right? And that is what supply chains are doing. So, next slide, please. So focus on China. I like China because I work a lot in this sphere. The next slide, please. So China is experiencing change now. So when the exchange rate is low, China is a prime area for putting a low value added production. When the exchange rate is low, there isn't a lot of incentive to go into innovate, and they're limited. Next. Right. So wages in China, what are we starting to see? Things are changing in China. Wages and exchange rates are increasing in China. That means that supply chains may not seek cost efficiencies that we want them to seek in the past, right? So thinking about your production in China, it won't change now, but it'll change in the future as those wages continue to increase, as those exchange rates in China start to increase. Low value added jobs are leaving China because of this fact. And that includes folks in textile and clothing. So there's going to be change in China towards more innovation, but that will alter our supply chain, right? So our supply chain should be focused on thinking about change to, let's say, a Southeast Asia in Bangladesh, if you're producing textiles or clothing in China, right? It won't change now because the volume like considerations are strong in China. But over time, we need to ensure that we revisit our supply chain to factor in our analysis here. Then next slide, please. So, what do we do to a supply chain? Okay. And you look at the supply chain on a chalkboard and you say, what do we do here? So like the first thing is you need to document all your risks. It's very, very, very important. And COVID taught us this, is that we never thought about a pandemic. So a typical approach for risk identification is to map out and assess the value chains of all major products, right? So you got to go and map it out and say, what is the risks here? So we look at supplier issues, our warehouse locations, and where we are in terms of geography, right? We need to, as a result, like the risks need to be tracked on an ongoing basis because risks are always changing, right? So in the past, we depended on certain suppliers. Now, because of the global context, we may not be able to depend only on one single supplier. A perfect example. Suppose that we have a risk analysis and we determine that the majority of our source of goods and services could come from one supplier, right? You identify that as a risk. So what you might do if your tolerance to risk is high, you may not go and account for the fact that there might be a production problem at that key supplier. If your tolerance to risk isn't as high, you might want to go and consider other suppliers, right? So you go and look at two other suppliers in another state. The analysis, it doesn't stop there. Where are those other two key suppliers? Are they in states that are prone to hurricanes? Are they in countries prone to political instability? Right? You need to factor that into the analysis, right? So the first step is to document. Look at the supply chain, see where the risks are, identify and crystallize those risks. That's the key thing. And, our next slide, please. Put the risks into a register, right? And evaluate the risks based on three criteriums. How it's going to impact the company if and when the risk becomes real, right? 2, what is the likelihood that the risk is going to go into materialize? And 3, how is the company positioned to handle a specific risk? From that analysis there, you're going to be able to create a level of risk tolerance that this company has to inherent risks in its supply chain, right? So if you're in the medical industry, then your tolerance to risk might be quite high because the inputs to your business are dependent on key goods like coming from key players. But if your tolerance is low because you're able to secure goods from a variety of suppliers, then you're not going to put the same amount of risk tolerance on things. So the more risk tolerant someone is, then we're going to see minor tweaks to our supply chains. But if you care a lot about risks, then you're going to go and look at these and say, okay, I need to factor in this scenario, and this scenario, and be able to execute it if the risk become real. The next slide, please. Another thing too is I see this in my tax practice all the time is things are not static. Things are always complex. Things are always changing. So we need to have a third and very important step of always trying to revisit our supply chains. Things change all the time. Political uncertainties change all the time. Tariffs change all the time. So we need to always ensure that we revisit things to ensure that new risks aren't coming about, like trade tensions that might go and disrupt our supply chains. If we start to see on the political landscape something change that is structural in nature, maybe we need to revisit our supply chain and find a new supply chain partners, right? Another thing that we should do too is to improve like how we like how we go and it's like like to bring in the digital economy. Excuse me, let me just drink the water here. So the digital economy becomes very, very important because AI, it's able to look at supply chains and they're able to bring data into the process and say this might be a problem. How products come to port and the time it takes to come to port from certain countries compared to other countries can be matched out on a digital platform. So bringing up like this idea of new ways to assess risk through technology becomes a very important thing. Okay, so like that's the third step to trying to monitor like the risk. It's a circle, right? So we first thing is we identify the risk and we say, here are the risks. And then we take the risks and we map them against a certain criteria. And then we build a thresholds to risk tolerance. And then we take action and we monitor it on a continuous basis. And next slide, please. Reassessment, it's got to be a rigorous like type of process. Review of supply chains and the risks. It takes place and must be considered. Review and the reassessment must always occur in order to improve how resistant that the supply chains are to risk. Okay, so if you're not able to go and do a serious assessment, then we're going to get exposed to a risk that if we didn't incorporate into our response analysis, it's going to really impact our business. So we need to be able to go and change that. The next slide, please. Unknown. Think of, I'm going to tell you a little analogy, and it's like Swiss cheese. Okay, what we need to do is to look at Swiss cheese and we see the holes in the Swiss cheese. Okay, and if you have a layer of defense, a risk can hit the Swiss cheese and go right through to your core business, right? So what the idea is that we build layered Swiss cheese, right? So if it goes through a hole, it hits something else that's going to catch it, right? That's the idea of layered defenses, right? So there are two types of like a risks. There are unknown, and then there are known risks, right? So what do we do to build up a strong defense? Well, worker training is an important issue. Securing alternative sources of supply is like another like issue. Next slide, please. So here is our mapping. What we do is we need to layer on every scale a new realm that's able to cut the risk of the shock, right? So like the first layer might be skilled workers that are up to date on on political issues, on science and technology. The second thing like could be employee a supplier like types of issues, right? And finding multiple sources of supplier should a certain like type of shock occur that is prevalent in your business, right? So if there is lots of layers of defense, then we're able to catch it eventually before it hits our core operations. Next slide, please. So, like this is a very important thing, and I think it's changing through our changes on the way we view workers, right? We need a culture that adopts to risk, okay? And we need a management that typically says, don't be afraid to highlight a risk. Don't be afraid to bring us bad news, right? It's better to bring new data to the table and ensure that we deal around that, right? So the thinking of employees is the thinking of management, right? So, what the management that needs to do is to highlight the risk tolerance of the firm, and the company's culture should allow for the risks to be addressed in an open environment. That becomes very, very important, because assessing the risk like the supply chains, it's not just, it's not the same as it is in 1970. Now the world economy is integrated, right? And where the risks are coming from vary. So we need a way for the company culture to change such that all levels of the company, in terms of that pyramid, is such that everyone's able to speak to risks, and based in the framework of risk tolerance. The next slide, please. It has to be a responsive environment, right? Employees need to have the ability to react, quickly to external change. Building a culture where the employees feel comfortable for the actions and decisions that they take is key, right? And the employees, their risk tolerance should be aligned to that of the organization, right? So the incentives that to the employee are such that when they take an action, it's consistent to the payoffs to the organization, right? Next slide, please. So impact of supply chains, huge during COVID. Inflation in Canada, in part, is high because of problems in supply chains. So inflation in Canada is 4.5%, 6% based on Statistics Canada and the Bank of Canada. Bank of Canada sets a range of 1% to 3% at a 2% target. Two reasons for increase in inflation: a lot of pent-up demand, and there was a lot of stimulus, and there's a lot of liquidity out there. But that's going to be short-term as folks start to spend that. And the second factor is, our problems in supply chains that have restricted goods that are coming into the markets. So too much money chasing after too few goods is causing our bump in inflation. Supply chains are crucial. So we need to ensure in the future that we do a better job in managing the supply chains in the presence of external shocks. Open economy, global economy, there is lots of challenges and more threats to our supply chains. And in trying to bring in science and tech and trying to do AI, that makes our abilities to identify risks and manage them become more and more important. Supply chains are going to need to be flexible, efficient, and they need to have a resilience to change. And it has to be very, very transparent. The next slide, please. So 5 steps to consider: rethink the supply chains. 2, build transparency and the resilience in the supply chains that meet our goals. 3, extract profits and keep costs to their lowest possible point. That's good. You maximize profits. 3, you got to drive our competitive advantage through solid internal controls. And 3, the digital space becomes very important in cost benefit analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, one point I wanted to get across here too is that we talked about the ops of supply chain. There is also a tax angle on supply chains as well, especially if the supply chains compose of companies that are related in nature. So a parent in Canada might have a supply chain of like a related parties around the world, right? And this is a financial tax issue supply chains between, related parties must ensure that they comply to 247 of the Income Tax Act, that each profit of entities comply to the arm's length standard, right? So supply chains, if it's related parties, is not strictly about taking out all the excess profits and putting it in California. 247 of the Income Tax Act says that when there are related parties that operate in different countries in a supply chain, the way profits are reported in the country are based on this arm's length standard, right? So profits in a supply chain that is composed of related parties follow three things: functions, assets, and risks. So the more functions one player assumes in a supply chain suggests that they should earn more profits. The more risk that one member in a supply chain incurs suggests that they should earn more profits in good years and the potential of losses in the bad years. And the more assets that an entity pledges, the more profits that they should earn because of that pledging. And that's a financial risk in the supply chain. Okay. So I went 2 minutes over my scheduled time, and that was not by design. If there's any questions, anything that you are thinking about that and that I should address, I'm free to do that now. Any questions? Is this a good way to ending a session on a Friday afternoon? It was a great session. It was a great privilege to be here. I'm going to provide my contact information. Should you, feel free to call me, send me an email, call me on the phone if there's any issues in the future or currently. Okay, thank you very much.